Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on Unit 715, Strategic Approaches to Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. This is just a short 10 to 15 minute video to give you a bit of a general overview of the assignment and to help you get started. I'm now going to hand over to our tutor James, who will take you through the assignment.
You, Charlotte. This is a nice assignment actually to do. It's very interesting and it's really topical for most people in organisations today, for sure. So it's a nice opportunity doing the assignment to actually enjoy the active research and writing it. There are just a few areas here that I want to point people's attention to, so that they're going to just be a bit more efficient in passing the assignment though. Let's get straight into it then. Learning outcome one then is understanding equality, diversity and inclusion at a strategic level. And so as with most of the assignments here, what we are looking for is a general appreciation for the topics at hand, and to kind of set the foundations upon which we're going to build an actual strategy in our organizations for improving or installing ED&I better where we are. So that's the kind of where we're at with this one. It's the kind of foundational part. Now, I believe I'm right in saying that the referral rates are highest on 1.1, the first question, Charlotte, is that right?
Yes, that's right. 1.1 is really one to take note of. We do get quite a few referrals on this point.
Okay, so we might loiter a little bit longer on this one for everybody's benefit. So the question here is to critically assess structural inequality within an organizational and societal context. So most people sometimes struggle on this one if they do, just because we haven't pulled the question apart and identified these aspects of it sufficiently. Here's my advice then. So the first thing is, as with all guidance on questions, we need to make a good definition to start with. In this case, it would be really beneficial to have a good, solid definition of what we think structural inequality means. If you can bring any other authors or definitions into play, but make your own up here is the idea. And that then gives this answer more context and also helps you to define what equality is as you go into the next question on 1.2. The command verb here is to critically assess. So there's going to be some critical approach to the assessment of what this thing is. And then the other part of the question is you want to do this then within both, and this is important, an organizational and a societal context. So we're looking at broad societal elements that could be structural inequality, but also in organizations too. It's important in your answer to cover both. So it's really super clear that you've taken the question apart and identified and addressed every component in it. So in terms of how you go around this, my advice would be to assess, critically assess. I'd be proposing maybe to select maybe a couple of types of structural inequality or candidates for structural inequality in both contexts. When you look at the organizational context, you could compare and contrast public, private, and third sectors. So that could be part of the context that you're going to look at structural inequality within then. For example, what the diversity rates of senior board members in charities is different from other sectors. So that might be evidence, you might say, there's some form of structural inequality. The common approaches, you don't have to do this, but common approaches for societal context could include things like education. So however you define structural inequality, typically it would be policy-based, it would be historical, baked in, self-propagating, these kind of things you might say could be part of your structural inequality definition. And so how does that apply in a societal context? Well, in education, we've got a two-tier system, which you might say that if people come from a wealthy, privileged background, they go to the best schools, they then have more money and better opportunities and better networks, which then allows them to send their kids to private education too, and round the cycle goes. So there's just elements of that. I think if you look at the question in that kind of fairly broad sense, and make sure you perform the critical assessment within your answers, then we'll get these ones passed. Now, to critically assess, a good question to ask yourself is the data suggesting structural inequality in the way you've suggested it, or could sometimes the data be suggesting something else is going on? What else could be driving that outcome than structural inequality. So that's, I think, where the critical assessment really comes to play. So what other factors might be in play that gets to see an outcome of something? So, an equal distribution of genders, maybe in nursing. Is it structural inequality or is it something else? Good questions to ask ourselves just to nail that critical assessment component. So hopefully that's a decent introduction, if you like, to how we might approach 1.1. 1.2 then we're going to discuss here. That's a command verb approaches to legal and good practice requirements for equality, diversity, and inclusion in an organizational context specifically this time. So the command verb is discuss. So that's going to be looking at arguments for and against, pros and cons. Bring a bit of lived experience in here. It's good advice to perform a discussion. Okay, but we're looking for contrasting views in your answer, ideally. Approaches means more than one, but not 20. So my advice, again, would probably be to select between 2 and 4 here that you think contrast each other nicely. And this is where, perhaps building off your definition of structural inequality, you're going to go ahead now and define equality and diversity and inclusion here. This is where we're going to go into those foundational definitions, which is so important for any of this assignment to make much sense. What do we mean by inclusion? What do we mean by diversity? What do we mean by equality? What are the different interpretations of these terms is really important to get onto here, I think. And again, organizational context, you might want to talk around public, private, third sectors, to look at different contexts and how these things might play out differently. So in terms of the answer, we're looking at both legal and good practice. So here it's the mandatory stuff that we have to do. So Equality Act, that kind of stuff you might want to talk around here. But we're also looking for policy for good practice for the stuff that we can choose to do. So you might look at things like Taylor report here, or there's various other sources you can use to bring in some examples of good practice. Again, maybe some lived experience you've seen here. But it's a good opportunity to look at those different approaches, some of the pros and cons, impacts of them, where they work best, where sometimes they don't. And there's good definitions here of equality, diversity, and inclusion. So I think everything else, in terms of apart from 1.1, I think everything else referral rates are pretty consistent, aren't they, Charlotte? So within a couple of
that's
percentage
right.
points are about the same. Yeah. Okay.
Very
Okay.
consistent.
Okay. So the good news is that most of the rest of the questions are equally the same kind of challenges to overcome for people. 1.3, critically appraise the influence of equality, diversity, and inclusion on the strategic objectives of an organization. Okay. So here the thing is to really look at how aspects of equality, diversity, and inclusion, as you defined them. That's why the definitions are really important, because it gives this answer more context. How you think those things influence the strategic objectives of the organization. So that's the horse before the cart piece that you need to really demonstrate in the answer. And you're going to critically appraise that influence. So to what extent do they, where don't they? You might talk here around maybe some lip service, or we're not really walking the talk in some of these areas. You might talk around some of the challenges around how those things might influence strategic objectives in the face of other drivers for strategic objectives. Where if we don't have a clear understanding perhaps of what each of these things mean as a collective, and there are very different interpretations, how can they drive strategic objectives in a coherent way anyway then? So for example, we've got really different views of what we think equality means here. How can that drive strategic objectives in a coherent and consistent way? That's the kind of stuff we can maybe talk around here. And then 1.4, present the business case for good practice in these areas. The indicative content suggests, and I think this is good practice to follow, that you break this down to 3 key areas. The first is the moral business case, so the more ethical and moral side of it. The second is a financial business case. And the final is a legal business case. There's a mandatory component coming into place here, why we must do and what the implications of not complying with law could be. Financial business case is a bit, well, okay, what's the return on investment in this stuff? If we do X, Y, and Z, what might we expect the financial return on that to be, or the financial mitigation to be through those things? On a moral business case, we can talk around maybe relaying how we approach equality, diversity, inclusion to our values, perhaps. Just maybe how we tend to differentiate the organization from competitors and comparables out there. What do we think is the right thing to do, and how do you describe that, and how does that then fit into good practice around equality, diversity, and inclusion where we are? Okay, so the big thing here is to cover those three areas specifically, I would advise, and make sure that you have made the case quite compellingly based on evidence, based on facts and figures if you can find them, and just make it really clear as to, we all might believe that improving or installing equality, diversity, inclusion is a good thing, but here we're asking you to describe exactly why you think that's the case. Make the case more specific and evidence based. That's the majority of the kind of foundational stuff done then. Then in learning outcome 2, we'll move into know how to develop strategic priorities for equality, diversity, and inclusion. This is where it becomes contextual to where we are now. 2.1, 2.2, 2.3 are very similar. And the whole thing is trying to kind of walk you through a process by which you can develop a strategy around ED&I. And so 2.1 is really interrogating the data and information environment that we may use to inform those strategic priorities. So, what are the different options we have in organizations to find data that could help us to try to make better choices or to work on the agenda of equality, diversity, and inclusion where we are. So, I don't know, recruitment data could be from recruitment process, it could be exit interviews, it could be tribunals, it could be external data sources, it could be employee engagement survey results if we ask the right questions. And that's kind of leads into the appraisal bit. So we might be asking some of the right questions, but are we asking the right things in the right ways of the right people at the right times, get truth? Or do we have 17, 27%, return rates in our employee engagement survey and trying to build a strategy off that? Is that a high enough sample? So this is a chance to really talk around the data environment around ED&I and look at some of the challenges there and the opportunities organizations have to choose good quality data to build their strategies on. Then in 2.2, 2.3, you're going to go ahead and do that where you are. So that's, what's your data environment? What are your key indicators for what you might change? What does good look like? How does that perhaps move you towards your vision and values in an effective way, or meet a strategic objective, or what have you? How do you know success? What measures would you put in place? And how does that feed into your data selection from 2.1 as well? And then in 2.3, here you're going to not just develop the priorities, but here what you're going to do is how to embed those things. So we're going to make it stick, make it work sustainably. So a good model to use here, and we would encourage you to use modeling where appropriate throughout, is something like Kotter's 8 steps or some change theory, so that you're able to really dig into that sustainable embedding, freezing of the culture bit, so that the things that you do have a legacy and stand the test of time. So that might feed in, for example, to policy rewriting, to renewals of those things periodically. It might fit into your recruitment policy in particular, how you select candidates for your organization in the future. Particularly one that goes missing for me is how we also select for future leaders. If you want to propagate behaviors and really embed that thing in, the attitudes from leadership and executives is so important here. And is that actually aligned with our sponsors ultimately, internally or externally, what they want from the organization? There's a bit of work to do there around the conditions to make ED&I really work better for everybody, I think. And that is a very brief overview of the unit. Hopefully, have I missed anything, Charlotte, that's obvious?
If you had 3 golden rules for writing the assignment, what would they be?
Yeah, 3 golden rules as always. So that would be definitions. Always, if you scan the question, make sure if there's anything in there that you think could be disagreeable, contentious, or subjective, make sure, like we've said with ED&I in this case, it's a good case in point. Second thing is make sure you've got a list of those command verb definitions and you meet what the command verb is asking you to do specifically in your question. And the final thing is less is more. So, and again, good examples we've gone through here where you're going to look at the depth of your answer to meet the command verb rather than just listing as many different factors as you can think of. that might be relevant to the topic. So we're looking at depth, not so much breadth. So, you know, when we looked at the first question there around the structural inequality, well, just choose a few examples, 2 in an organizational and 2 in a societal. That's sufficient to answer the question as long as you critically assess them. And approaches to legal and good practice, you could write a book on that's being done. We're looking for a selection of approaches you think add value, are different from each other, are interesting. Yeah. And so it's just being practical and pragmatic about the way you answer in those ways.
Okay, thank you very much, James. We're looking forward to receiving all your assignments, and do remember we're here to help, so you can reach us anytime at the email address cmi@impd.co.uk. All right, thanks everyone.